What are the sorts of sneaky ethical considerations we might need to consider beyond the issues we've covered in this module so far? Sure, it's important to respect all aspects of people and the broad social media approach of do no harm. But is this all we need to think about? Dr. Tama Lever is a senior lecturer at the Department of Internet Studies at Curtin University in Western Australia, and he's an expert on social media. One of the entirely fascinating areas Tama focuses on is births and deaths in social media. I spoke with Tama about some of the ethical considerations surrounding the use of social media at our births and deaths.
The Internet Studies Department here has the strange pleasure of being the first named Internet Studies Department in the world. So we've been doing Internet Studies for more than 15 years now, which seems a really long time in Internet time. The department itself has quite diverse research interests, but one of our core things has been the question of social media and identity, and in very different ways. But the real question that interests me today is the way that looking at birth and pre-birth practices and looking at death and memorialization, if looking at those ends of the way that we use social media and looking at how those provoke big questions and big challenges that we don't have easy answers for, looking at those ends informs better what we do every day and lets us remember that social media is always a co-creative process. We're always creating ourselves, but we're always creating the legacy and the history of someone else at the same time.
So let's focus in on what you're talking about there. So the bookends of, I guess, life, our digital lives is where you're very much interested in. So the births and deaths and how our identities are born and died within social media. Is that a correct way of talking about it?
Absolutely. So there's many values, but one of the most significant values in studying birth and death on social media is that what it really reveals to us is that social media is never just about an individual. Social media by its nature is a collaborative process, but it's also a collaborative construction. But when you look at, say, the way that parents construct their children's identity, often before birth, so the sharing of an ultrasound photo and those joyous moments are also the moments where that young person gets named into being. So the traces that we start leaving exist before they're born. And as those traces develop, we as parents and loved ones and as broader community essentially shape that person's online identity and online presence. And at the other end, of course, when we think about death and memorialization, we have some fairly, we all think we have fairly clearly established norms around death and mourning. And yet social media, from the question of sort of selfies at funerals through to what do we do with the traces of people on Facebook or on email or on their various presences, what do we do with them, again, speaks to the fact that the people making those decisions are not the people being represented. So it's a collaborative process about both beginning lives, we are on social media for a period of time, and then we have to work out what to do with the stuff at the other end. And so looking at birth and death really reveals the complexity of the relationships that build even one person's identity and reputation online.
So what are some of the tensions you see in the affordances of, people getting into these kinds of socially constructed activities in social media, and then some of the ethical challenges that you see running concurrently with that?
If we just take the most basic question around the question of privacy, for example, the sharing of an ultrasound photo is a joyous moment. And it's also a moment where the question of being directly responsible for somebody else's privacy kicks in. And what we can see in that moment is we're making a series of decisions about the sharing of our personal joy and our sort of excitement, but also a decision about the first traces of another human being something that we're sharing. But equally, there's other questions about persistence. So do we want to be using social media services that by default leave everything behind? And that question of the difference between, say, Instagram versus Snapchat, which doesn't by default persist, is equally an interesting question. And the question of unintended sharing. So an ultrasound's fascinating, not just because of the picture of the young person that's growing, but because of the framing of that. If you look at an ultrasound picture, by default, it lists the mother's name, it lists the location where the photo is taken, it lists the estimated date of birth, it lists a whole bunch of other sort of vital statistics. And so that information is captured in an image, and we often don't think of images as sharing too much extra data, if you like, but it's one of those real moments where it's trivial work for an algorithm to read that information, turn it back into text and make it searchable, for example. And equally, if that image persists, then the longer it's there, the more likely it could be read through those sort of filters. And of course, we've got the basic question of GPS being turned on many devices. So there's questions of traces, there's questions of history, and there's questions of privacy, all wrapped together in that instant of sharing.
So let's go to the other end of the life cycle now, to the death end. What's your take on the right to be forgotten with social media?
The right to be forgotten is incredibly challenging because it involves us reconceptualizing social media from the ground up. Social media at its heart is driven by what I talk about as a social media contradiction. So as a service to users, we generally conceptualize the social part. It's the communicative ability, it's the joy of sharing. That's the thing that we focus on as most important. For the companies that provide these platforms, they're invested in the media half. It's the fact that this information persists, that this information is aggregatable and analyzable, and you can basically derive advertising from the persistence of that information. And this contradiction is a really hard thing to see in the moment, if you like, but really drives a lot of the challenges that come up. So the right to be forgotten in relation to the sort of the social media contradiction then is we're going to have to basically have social media companies that work out a different way to do their practice. If we genuinely want social media that doesn't persist, if we want social media that is in the moment and goes away, then the question of the way that most platforms operate has to change. And I think that's a really fundamental difficulty because these platforms are premised on the more information we've got about you, the better picture we can build, the better we can sell targeted advertising. I do think, especially for young people though, creating spaces where they can experiment with their identity and make mistakes and that not haunt them forever is incredibly important. And I do think that while Snapchat might not be the perfect answer, that idea of social media that deletes by default, I think is very, very important, and I think does provide some of those spaces of sort of youthful experimentation that you have to have. If everything we ever do was recorded, none of us would be successful adults. We'd all be able to point at things and go, that was the big mistake you made, it's recorded forever, I will judge you because of that. And I think if we can cordon off certain spaces for young people at least, that's a significant part of it. I think that the broader right to be forgotten conversation for adults will be a much harder one. But I think if culturally, I think we still sort of acknowledge that young people should get the benefit of not being judged by all the rules that apply to adults. And I think that's where the right to be forgotten conversation is most important.
Some of what Dr. Lever highlights is the seemingly innocent social media practices that we undertake in our everyday lives may have unthought of consequences. A proud mother or father sharing an image of their newborn, or even the ultrasound image in the prenatal state, is an arrangement that never received consent from all parties. And it's really interesting to think through why this is problematic. The proud parents are sharing this moment with their family and friends via social media, which is a very simple and fast way to let all of those special people know about this wonderful moment wherever they are. However, as we've previously pointed out, social media is full of hidden infrastructure, policy, and private shortcomings. So without consent, parents are placing their children at the mercy of these arrangements and are for the most part oblivious to the potential complications. Now, this is only one example, but it's crucial to have this critical approach whenever we're using social media. What might seem like a simple use may have dire consequences.